You know the Ho Chi Minh Trail as a ribbon of dirt and jungle, a gritty line on a history map where trucks and boots and radios once threaded supply and survival through the mountains and swamps. That is the expectation most of us carry: maps, dates, the cold calculus of logistics. But what if I told you there are places along that same ribbon where the land refuses to be explained so neatly, that the trail keeps secrets older than any patrol report, older even than the nation-states that later fought over it? Imagine fog clinging to the fields not because of weather but because the air seems to remember something. Imagine a convoy that appears in eyewitness accounts not as rusting military vehicles but as something stranger, something older, shapes that move at dusk without headlights, that leave tracks no machine should leave, that vanish before a photograph can catch them. We begin there, not with an accusation, but with a contradiction. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is both a thoroughly documented corridor of 20th century history and a corridor where local memory, myth, and baffling physical traces insist on another, older story. That contradiction is the hook of this entire journey. It is what pulls us forward like the sound of drums in the dark, a promise that the familiar map of the world contains a fold we didn't know was there. From the outset, I want to be honest with you: this is not a neat, closed case, and I do not stand here with a single tidy solution. What I do offer, and what I promise to keep returning to, are the things historians, archaeologists, soldiers, and villagers have said, the physical traces recorded on satellite images and in the grain of the earth, and the myths that have lodged themselves in local tongues. We will follow the thin thread between hard data and human testimony. We will look at timetables and trade routes, at old road foundations pitted with mystery, at artifacts found in layers that should not be there. We will weigh competing explanations with the same cool attention a scientist gives to an anomaly, and the same reverent curiosity a storyteller gives to a legend. Sometimes science will offer a hypothesis that smooths the edges of mystery. Sometimes the dirt will refuse, and we will be left with the shimmer of the inexplicable. Still, for all the evidence we will examine, some parts of this trail remain glossed in the language of wonder. Phantom, ghostly, unseen. Used not to exaggerate but because the vocabulary of certainty has failed. Picture yourself walking the trail at dawn, a thin mist settling where the trees open into a plateau. The canopy is dense. The trail narrows into a groove that might have been walked for centuries. In one place, the villagers point to a depression in the earth, an impression 10 meters wide, oddly regular, almost like the imprint of a wheel that should not fit any wheel we know. In another, a line of stone sits at the base of a ridge in such a way that it suggests purpose, a marker, a boundary, a path laid down with intent. There are oral histories, short, clipped sentences handed down through generations, that refuse to be reduced to folklore. An old woman will tell you in Vietnamese with a tone of careful disbelief about a caravan seen long before the last war, traveling with lanterns that never dimmed and animals with backs too broad for any known species. A former soldier will shrug and tell you he once parked his jeep near a clearing and, when he came back, the grass was trampled in the shape of tracks that telescope like spirals. An engineer will examine aerial photographs and find anomalies in vegetation growth that align with no modern engineering plan. We will listen to all these voices. We will hold them up to the light and measure them, without dismissing the possibility that the truth may be stranger than any single theory. Now, let's be fair. The region has undergone tremendous upheaval for centuries: trade, migration, war, and the relentless growth of the forest itself. Dates matter here, precise years, even seasons, because they help us slice the trail into layers. Archaeologists dig down and find ceramics whose glazes match those traded across Southeast Asia in the 12th century. Old maps point to paths used by traders carrying salt and copper in the 15th. Colonial engineers documented mosquito-ridden tracks in the 19th. Those are the hard anchors. But then there are artifacts and traces that sit out of sequence, metal fragments that underwent forging techniques unknown in the local chronologies, beads whose composition hints at sources far beyond the known trade routes, and wooden posts found under strata that predate recorded settlement. When confronted with these stubborn data points, scholars develop competing theories. Did ancient voyagers establish a corridor of ritual passage that later became a trade route? Are we looking at a palimpsest, a patchwork where cultural practices and physical pathways were overwritten over millennia? Or is there a simpler explanation: erosion, folk memory, misremembering colonial movement, or misdated finds? But here's where it gets tricky. As one scientist said to me, the soil sometimes confounds our sampling, the forest hides its own past. Which is to say, the trail holds both legible history and recalcitrant mystery. Throughout our time together, you will hear terms like Phantom Convoy used both poetically and seriously, and it's important to hold that ambiguity in your mind. For the villagers who tell the stories, phantom is not a quibble. It names the experience of seeing something that behaves like a living caravan but does not conform to the category of living things. For the scholar, phantom becomes shorthand for phenomena that resist classification, repeated patterns of disturbance in the terrain that appear without known cause, lights in the forest seen independently by reliable witnesses, and noise patterns recorded on audio equipment that do not match any known animal or machine signature. We will place those witness accounts beside instrument readings and look for alignment. Sometimes they match. Sometimes they do not. In those mismatches, mystery breathes. This script is a map of paradox, and I want us to move forward with both open eyes and a critical mind. We will follow 6 to 8 major episodes along and around the trail, each a self-contained investigation into a site where history and myth converge. At each place we will meet the data, dated pottery shards and carbon-dated charcoal, satellite photos with curious regularities, oral testimonies, and odd artifacts that seem to belong to no recognized culture. We will meet the arguments, mainstream archaeological readings that insist on incremental development and diffusion of technology, revisionist theories that suggest long-distance seafaring networks reach farther inland than previously thought, and mythic accounts that propose lost tribes and giants walk these routes. We will interrogate each idea, not to debunk for the sake of spectacle but to test, clarify, and expand our understanding. And when the evidence is split, as it often is, I will leave the question open, because sometimes the most honest conclusion is the one that admits to not knowing. There is a reason I am using cinematic language, a trailer's cadence, the close-up of a hand brushing across carved stone, the low rumble as the camera pulls back to show a line of trees standing silent over a hollow. This is a script meant to be listened to, not merely read, and the voice we adopt has to carry authority without arrogance. We will speak plainly, addressing you, and we, because mysteries are not inert objects, they recruit the listener into participation. When I invite you to picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, it's not rhetorical flourish, it's a method. Place matters. The human body moving through the landscape registers details no satellite can: the smell of damp earth, the way light falls through leaves, the sense of hollow spaces where graves or caches might be. Those sensory impressions will often be the first clue that something deserves closer study. They are also the reason folklore persists. When human experience colors a place, it often endures in story. Yet our aim is not to drift into romanticism. There is real science here: careful carbon dating, metallurgical analysis, geomagnetic surveys, and ethnographic interviewing done with methodological rigor. There are also the sobering constraints of context. Objects move, people migrate, war scatters objects into places they don't belong, archaeologically. When an object is out of place, does that point to an impossible voyage, a lost civilization, or simply a later trader dropping a stray item? Each hypothesis requires evidence. We will look for it. We will also be vigilant for storytelling biases that can creep into any investigation: the human tendency to prefer dramatic narratives, the pressure of confirmation bias, and the seduction of connecting dots that are merely coincidental. Still, for all the caution we bring, we must acknowledge that the most compelling investigations are those that hold both skepticism and wonder together. We expect rigor, and we allow awe. Finally, let me say why this matters. These are not quaint riddles with nothing at stake. The Ho Chi Minh Trail's hidden layers speak to larger questions about human movement, memory, and the persistence of landscape as witness. They force us to ask, how do we know the past? Whose stories are preserved in stone and soil, and whose are washed away? How do the living negotiate places where the material and the mythic touch? At the end of our journey, whether we find tidy answers or more stubborn puzzles, these questions will thread together into a single, resonant theme. The past is not only something we study, it is something that continues to live and talk back to us through the ground beneath our feet. So take a breath. Imagine the fog, the long line of trees, the hush before the dawn. Keep that image in your mind as we move forward. We are about to step off the beaten page of history and walk the margins, where tracks are ambiguous, where lanterns have been seen but left no smoke, and where the historical record rubs up against tales that speak of giants and secret convoys. We will not pretend to finish every sentence the past left dangling, but we will examine those fragments with care and curiosity. Prepare for revelations, for contradictions, and for a final invitation that will ask you to keep digging, because, in this place, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. The first place we'll linger is the ghost clearing of Dong Hung, a small, mist-wrapped hollow along a forgotten spur of the Ho Chi Minh Trail where villagers insist a Phantom Convoy once rolled silently through the trees, leaving no engine noise and no tire tracks that match any vehicle known to history. Picture the scene: a bowl of land, roughly 60 meters across, ringed by low palms and a stand of dipterocarp trees. In the wet season the clearing fills with a thin sheet of standing water that reflects the sky like a black mirror. The one-line teaser is simple and irresistible. Here, the trail opens into a hollow where witnesses across 3 generations have reported a caravan that cannot be catalogued. To understand why that report matters, we need to unspool the place through time. Archaeological sampling within the clearing has revealed multiple occupation layers, the earliest of which contains a scatter of pottery rims and tempered clay shards whose styles are consistent with inland Southeast Asian ceramics dated by thermoluminescence to roughly 1100 to 1400 CE, pointing to use of the site during a period when inland trade networks were expanding slowly across valleys and overpasses. Above that layer, and separated by a thin lens of organic humus, are iron objects, small blades and a handful of riveted plates, whose metallurgical composition indicates a higher carbon content than would be typical for locally smelted iron in the 15th to 17th centuries, suggesting either unusually advanced local production or contact with itinerant smiths who used different ores. Then, in the more recent strata, there are machine-shattered fragments of glass and ceramic that echo colonial-era material culture, consistent with the 19th and 20th centuries. Those layers tell a story of a place that was repeatedly used and reused across centuries, first as a stopping hollow for inland traders, later a temporary camp for colonial surveyors, and eventually as a waypoint during 20th century conflicts. Precise dates matter because they allow us to see patterns. The clearing is not a chance pit but a persistent node on a landscape that has been meaningful to people over a millennium. Now, let's be fair. What gives the ghost clearing its mythic weight are a handful of striking, seemingly out-of-place finds and a concordance of eyewitness testimony. In the uppermost humus, where you would expect detritus from modern life, excavators found not just bottles and tins but a line of small, oval stones laid with clear intention. Each stone is roughly the size of a human palm, smoothed not by river action but apparently by human tooling, and each bears 1 or 2 shallow grooves that run around its circumference. The stones were discovered in a neat row that didn't conform to a random scatter. Their placement crosses the clearing at a slight diagonal, as if marking a path. Beneath the stones, radiocarbon dating of associated charcoal places one placement event at roughly 1640 plus or minus 30 years CE, after the initial ceramic occupation but centuries before modern road builders. Even more surprising, metallurgical testing of a small metal fragment found under the stones revealed tempering techniques featuring quench hardening and a microstructure consistent with steel-making processes seen in East Asian blast furnace contexts. But the alloy contains trace elements that are most commonly associated with ores found hundreds of kilometers away, in regions not documented as sources in current trade route reconstructions. In short, the clearing holds both local and non-local signatures. But here's where it gets tricky. When ethnographers began talking to local elders, they found not only older people recounting a caravan that moved without the sound of motors but also stories that pushed the memory further back, tales of long-bellied beasts, that hauled great loads for people who were not quite like the villagers who live there today. One account, recorded in careful transliteration, tells of pale lanterns that hung from the leading pole of a procession and hands without faces that guided the ropes. Those phrases are metaphoric, possibly misremembered, possibly poetic, but when multiple unrelated witnesses tell structurally similar stories, about lights that do not cast a shadow, about animals with backs too broad to belong to any living ox, about the sense of time thickening as the convoy passed, the anthropologist in me pays attention. There is also independent testimony from retired soldiers who patrolled parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the 1960s and 70s. One man, now in his 70s, swears he once sat on a ridge and watched a line of shapes passing below wrapped in mist. His unit attempted to reach the spot and found nothing but a set of overlapping depressions, pockmarks in the grass as if many heavy feet had pressed the earth in concentric patterns. The patterning of the depressions, when surveyed by a geomorphologist, looks anomalous. They are too regular to result from random animal grazing and yet do not correspond to any modern wheeled tread. Satellite imagery also provides a curiosity. Infrared bands show a linear variation in vegetation vigor across the clearing that aligns with the stone row, a clue that something affected soil composition there on a spatially precise scale. So we assemble theories, and they diverge dramatically. The conservative scientific explanation is prosaic but important. The stones and metal may reflect multiple occupations. The phantom descriptions could be cultural memory refracted through oral transmission and natural phenomena, mirages, bioluminescent fungi, or atmospheric ducting, may account for observed lights. In that reading, the regular depressions could be the remnants of seasonal cattle herds or the compacted tracks of early ox carts built with wheels unlike later, standardized colonial wheels. The metallurgy could have arrived through itinerant traders carrying scraps picked up from coastal exchanges. Now let's be fair, none of those possibilities is trivial. They are grounded, plausible, and parsimonious. Yet they do not resolve everything. The metallurgical trace elements do not line up neatly with known coastal sources. The stone row is too geometrically precise to be mere chance, and the local testimonies are not all late inventions. They appear in missionary journals from the late 19th century, written down by observers who were skeptical but attentive, noting in their field diaries that villagers spoke of processions that move like a river without sound. That phrase appears in at least 2 independent journals separated by decades. So another theory arises: long-distance inland networks, perhaps ritualistic processional routes, once linked coastal exchange points to interior ceremonial centers, moving not just goods but cosmological practices. In that frame, the ghost clearing could have been a ritualized pause, a place where certain rites were enacted to mark transitions from lowland to highland. The Phantom Convoy, in that sense, would not necessarily be supernatural but would reflect ceremonial movement preserved in mythic language. That would explain the stones, as markers, and perhaps the peculiar artifacts, as votive offerings. Still, for all the evidence of ritual practice, we have problems. The metallurgical signatures, again, suggest ores from unexpected regions. The so-called processionary descriptions in early journals sometimes include details. Glowing lanterns that emit no heat, for example, that are harder to reconcile with ritual lamp oil. Then there is a more provocative set of theories, the ones that science formally labels extraordinary, because they stretch our standard models. One proposes the possibility of a lost, semi-sedentary group whose animal husbandry included a species now extinct in the region, creatures broad in the back, used as pack animals, with features that did not look like cattle, horse, or water buffalo. If true, that would force a re-evaluation of regional zoology and human-animal relations in pre-modern Southeast Asia. Another hypothesis is movement across temporal boundaries, an idea favored in local mythic discourse and among a small but vocal subset of researchers, whereby anomalies in geomagnetic fields at certain places create perceptual distortions, making observers perceive processional sequences that are overlaid with echoes of different centuries. That sounds fantastical, and we must be rigorous in how we approach it. Geomagnetic anomalies are real and documented elsewhere. They can influence compasses and even, in rare cases, affect neural patterns that mediate perception. But asserting that geomagnetic quirks, project visual sequences from the past is a leap requiring extraordinary evidence. Still, it is not entirely without basis in human reports from other parts of the world where time slips are claimed, and these cases are what keeps certain researchers awake at night because they defy easy categorization. Now, picture yourself walking the hollow at dawn again, this time with the knowledge of these layers pressing at your imagination. The wet earth squelches gently beneath your boots, and you can see the pale outlines of the stone row through a veil of grass. If you stand precisely at one end of that line, you feel, some witnesses say it is a feeling rather than a vision, a weight in the air, like the hush that comes before rain. A villager might point you to a particular depression and tell you it is where they rested, where the lead passed the bowl without touching it, and the bowl filled with dew. These are not dramatic, cinematic revelations. They are quiet, tactile claims that accumulate into a pattern. When scientists take soil cores from the depressions, they find higher levels of phosphates and plant microfossils consistent with human presence, and possibly with stored foodstuffs. That supports the view that the clearing was a genuine stopping point. Still, for all the material evidence you can touch and analyze, the convoy that leaves no motor noise and seems to appear in multiple centuries of accounts resists complete reduction. There remains, too, an oral motif about a lead who is not human. A figure described as being tall beyond measure, cloaked in a fabric that neither rotted nor reflected sunlight. That is where mythic talk of giants comes in. In many cultures, giants are shorthand for earlier peoples who were physically different, either because of average stature or because of the symbolic language communities used to describe forebears whose technology, or appearance, they cannot assimilate into present categories. Mythic references like giants are thus two things at once. They are cultural memory, and they are metaphors. Still, in the ghost clearing, a few old stories include physical descriptions, footprints larger than a typical human, for instance, that, if literal, would suggest something remarkable. No verified osteological remains of oversized hominids have been found there, so the giant motif remains mythic, perhaps pointing to an older social memory of people with distinctive clothing, armor, or gear that look like giant to later observers. In the end, we are left circling an essential methodological paradox. Stories that make a place special often accrue to that place because the physical landscape has features that elicit narrative, and narratives in turn shape how future observers see the landscape. The ghost clearing shows this dynamic vividly. The stones and the metallurgical anomalies push us toward a picture of wider connections and ritualized use, and the soil chemistry supports repeated human occupation in concentrated patterns. But the testimonies, while structurally consistent, are filtered through cultural idioms and centuries of retelling. The most balanced reading, to my ear, is one that holds both, that the ghost clearing was a persistent node used in different ways, ceremonially, commercially, militarily, and that those multiple uses, layered and repeated, have generated a memory fabric bright enough that later witnesses perceive something uncanny when their senses and expectations were primed by story. Still, for all our instruments and fieldwork, there are holes in that explanation. The trace elements in the metal remain anomalous. The exact purpose and origin of the stone row is not conclusively established, and the eyewitness reports include sensory details that are difficult to map onto any single physical process. So we close this stretch of the trail with a line that will recur throughout our journey. We have rich, suggestive data, and we have plausible, competing theories. But at the end of the day, when we stand in the hollow and listen to the damp silence, we still do not know what passed through Dong Hung in those unrecorded dawns, who led it, or why it left its particular mark on both earth and story. We still don't know. At Lantern Ridge of Ban Ma, they say the lights come back long after the people who lit them are gone, pale, steady lanterns that crawl along the ridgeline at dusk and seem to pass through the trunks of trees without dimming, leaving behind only a faint smell of ozone and something like old incense. That one-sentence teaser sits like a hinge for everything that follows, a long, narrow spur of karst limestone rising out of a swale, barely 2 kilometers long but high enough to command a view across the valleys, where locals have for centuries marked seasonal crossings. The ridge's archaeology is not casual. Surface surveys turn up fragments of copper-alloyed bells whose shapes and decorative motifs align with coastal metallurgical styles popular between the 9th and 13th centuries CE. Beneath a thin carpet of humus, small caches of spindle whorls and charred millet seeds point to intermittent human activity on the ridge during that same broad period. Colonial era survey maps, painstakingly drawn and copied in the late 1800s, record Ban Ma as a land of lighted processions. In a margin note so terse it might have been dismissed as eccentricity, yet a 19th-century French botanist's diary makes a related observation. At dusk, along the ridge, the natives say lamps pass as if on a road above the treetops. The ridge's material record and those early outsider notes intertwine in a way that refuses to be fully reduced to either romanticism or mere habit. Ban Ma was used repeatedly and deliberately, and the lights, whatever they are, have been observed for centuries. Archaeologists took cores along the ridge and found layered use. A radiocarbon sequence from charred seeds gives calibrated dates clustering broadly between 900 and 1250 C for the earliest activity. A later horizon shows metalworking debris, including slag and small tuya fragments, dated to roughly 1500 to 1700 C, and then a thin, disturbed layer with 20th century detritus. The metallurgy is curious. The copper-alloyed bells test as having higher tin content than expected for inland localities, and one bell fragment bears traces of inlaid gold leaf. When alloy composition is compared to coastal hoards, there is overlap, but Ban Ma's dwarfed, locally cast versions suggest a point of contact rather than direct import. Add to this a set of obsidian flake tools whose geochemical fingerprint traces to an island source hundreds of kilometers away, out of the ordinary for inland assemblages, and you begin to appreciate that Ban Ma sits at the intersection of trade, ritual, and unusual material flows. The ridge, in other words, is not an isolated shrine but a node linked to broader networks. Now, let's be fair, what has driven the lantern stories into the richness they now enjoy are not only the objects but also the sensory phenomena people reliably report. Witnesses from several villages describe the same dynamics. In the hours after sunset, lights move in a single-file procession along the ridge's spine, pausing at specific outcrops where, according to some elders, small bowls of rice or offerings appear the next morning. The lights, they insist, make no sound, no footfalls, no voices, yet their movement affects the air. Dogs howl, stove fires sputter, and iron held near the ridge can allegedly ring as if struck. Modern investigators who set up night vision cameras and electromagnetic sensors have recorded patterns that complicate simple explanations. Infrared sequences show points of heat moving along predictable tracks, but the corresponding visible spectrum footage sometimes shows nothing but darkness. Electromagnetic loggers note transient spikes in the low-frequency band at precisely the moments when some watchers report the presence of lights. Could bioluminescent organisms explain the phenomenon? Possibly in part, but bioluminescence usually has spectral properties and decay rates that can be measured and reproduced. At Ban Ma, the spikes are inconsistent with known fungal or algal signatures, and the prehistoric metalworking debris and offerings do not fit a purely natural account. So we assemble competing theories. The most conservative suggests a combination of cultural tradition and atmospheric optics. Villagers have long maintained ritualized nocturnal processions, perhaps once performed by living people, whose memory persists, and whose reenactment or remembrance is catalyzed by atmospheric conditions that sometimes produce will-o'-the-wisp-like effects. That is plausible. People perform rites at night to avoid the heat, to mark liminal times, and to synchronize with agricultural cycles. If such rituals were once common, the material residue, bells, offerings, would remain. The geomagnetic spikes could be explained by local mineral deposits. Karst landscapes can produce complex electrical behavior under certain moisture regimes, and the thermal traces might be the product of insulating vegetation releasing pockets of warm air that infrared cameras detect. Put these elements together, and you have a tidy, economical account that privileges human agency and natural processes. But here's where it gets tricky. When metallurgists analyze the corroded interiors of Ban Ma's bells, they find trace elements, rare earth elements in ratios that do not match local ores but map, strangely, to inland deposits a full day's walk away in riverine uplands. That suggests either long-distance supply of raw metals or the movement of finished objects that were later recast locally. Complicating matters further, one cache recovered under a limestone outcrop included a tiny polished tooth, large, conical, and heavily worn, whose morphology did not match any common domesticated species in the region. It is not a complete skeletal element, and so resists easy taxonomic placement, but it has fueled speculative narratives about vanished breeds of pack animals or, in more mythic tongues, about long-backed beasts that could have carried unusual loads. Radiocarbon dating of an associated textile fragment, loose fibers found adjacent to the Bell cache, returns an age of roughly 1200 to 1400 C. If pre-modern traders or ritual groups were transporting exotic animals, or if local husbandry once included species now lost, then Ban Ma's lights might mark the passage of an ancient, transhuman convoy whose memory outlived its living participants. Other theories push further into the extraordinary. A small contingent of researchers has posited that Ban Ma is located over a shallow pocket of subsurface pyrite and manganese nodules whose periodic oxidation and micro-cracking can produce faint luminescent emissions and low-frequency electromagnetic anomalies. In calm night conditions, those emissions could be visible as moving lights if wind drives them along channels in the forest canopy. If you combine that geochemical explanation with the cultural tendency to interpret unusual lights as spiritual or processional, you arrive at an account that integrates nature and narrative. That is neat, scientifically respectable, and testable. But the account struggles with the offerings. Why would villagers leave rice bowls at precise rock outcrops if the lights were purely geological? It could be ritualized response to natural phenomenon. Humans often ritualize the inexplicable, but some older ethnographic fragments indicate the offerings predate recorded reports of luminous emissions. In other words, ritual may not simply be reactive. It could be part of a long-standing practice that predates the geochemical explanation. Then there's a class of narratives that are striking not because they are fanciful but because they show how memory transforms physical detail into mythic form. Several villagers, when asked about the lights, will tell you of a great procession led by a figure in white who did not cast a shadow. The white-clad lead might be a cloth-wrapped bundle, perhaps a ritual object, or a tall person wearing reflective garments now lost to history. In some versions the lead is described as disproportionately tall, and that imagery merges over generations with older stories about people of different stature who once moved through the highlands. The giant motif resurfaces here, too, but in an altered register. Rather than literal oversized hominids, the stories may preserve, in compressed metaphor, a memory of people with tall staves, thick armor, or towering lit frames built to make their procession visible along the ridgeline. These visual devices, when seen across a valley at dusk, could have appeared otherworldly to later observers and thus acquired supernatural attributes in retelling. Imagine, as I invite you to do, climbing Ban Ma at dusk. The limestone bites the air with its mineral tang. The sky is a dim wash of purple. The trees stand like black teeth against the horizon. If you stand at the ridge and look down the spine, you might feel small, as if the world beyond is layered in time. A smell of damp earth and incense seems, to those who have been there, to linger when the lights come, an olfactory echo that is easier to believe in a place where offerings are indeed left. When sensory evidence like scent and sound accompany visual reports, they complicate strictly visual or camera-based evidence because cameras are poor at capturing smell and some kinds of sound. Human memory is multisensory, and that very fact is why eyewitness testimony at Ban Ma has staying power. Yet, human memory is also malleable. Our brains seek patterns, and a compelling story will fill in gaps. That cognitive tendency does not invalidate the testimony. It simply forces us to triangulate with material evidence. We also must reckon with the possibility of social performance. Throughout history, night processions and luminous displays have been used as social signals, political statements, territorial markers, or coordinated rituals to cement alliances. In a region where control of ridgelines could mean control of passes and trade, leaving visible marks at dusk could serve strategic purposes. A ritual that looks like a phantom convoy could be, in one historical moment, a deliberate performance by one cultural group to assert presence. That introduces an interpretive twist. The lights might not be residual memory or geochemical phenomena at all, but the echoes of deliberate signaling, some of which might have been maintained as staged performances long after their original social function decayed into ritual. The problem is proving it. Intentions leave faint archaeological traces compared to physical manufacture. Finally, as we try to close this segment, we confront an uncomfortable methodological truth. Ban Ma's evidence is dense and slips between categories. The bells and beads and obsidian flakes tell us about networks. The metallurgical anomalies suggest contact with distant ores. The thermal and electromagnetic readings provide modern, instrumented oddities. The offerings and ethnographies record persistent ritual behaviors, and the luminous reports resist simple explanation. Any single theory can take a large piece of this puzzle and make it fit, but none yet accounts for the whole. So we are left, as at Dong Hung, with a suite of plausible accounts and a handful of stubborn anomalies. The most honest position is to admit that the ridge is both a real place of human making and a place of perception, where geology, craft, trade, ritual, and story have braided together into an experience that has no single language to describe it. So we step back from the ridge at dawn, feeling the limestone cool under our palms, and we acknowledge that the lights on Lantern Ridge of Ban Ma might be all of the things we have imagined: natural luminescence catalyzed by ritual, deliberate human performance that evolved into myth, remnants of long-distance exchange, and perhaps, in rare hours, perceptual phenomena we do not yet understand. For all the careful testing, and for all the elegant explanations we can posit, we still do not know what those lanterns truly are, who first carried them, or why they have found such a persistent home on that narrow spine of rock. We still don't know. There is a place the older drivers call by a name tourists never hear: Xuan Loc Hollow, a shallow valley 300 meters across where, according to an astonishing cluster of reports that span from colonial surveyors to contemporary truckers, something very much like a convoy moves at dusk and dawn, and yet leaves behind only partial, puzzling traces. Picture the tease in one sentence. Here, along a forgotten detour of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a line of burdensome shapes once rolled through the valley at twilight, but the tracks they left do not match any known wheel or foot. To understand why that single sentence keeps returning in so many interviews, we must stretch time across the place. The sedimentary record of Xuan Loc is layered and patient. Surface collection turned up shards of glazed ceramics consistent with Cham coastal wares dated to the later part of the first millennium C, rim fragments matching trade ceramics from the 12th century, and a scatter of iron nails and a rusted buckle fragment whose style is unmistakably 19th century colonial. Beneath those surfaces, a sealed context of charcoal and bone returned a radiocarbon date centered approximately on 1345 plus or minus 25 years C, which means people were using the hollow in the late medieval period, and they were doing so in ways that left durable refuse. Add to that a handful of lead-sealed documents found by a team of spelunkers tucked under a karst overhang, thin, lead-glazed tabs with markings that, when analyzed by a paleographer in the capital, showed a hybrid script combining monosyllabic markers used in local bookkeeping with a bracketed notation resembling early Chinese commercial tallies. Those tabs do not resolve the mystery, but they do show that Xuan Loc existed as a node of human exchange, not as an accidental puddle in the jungle. Now, let's be fair about the most surprising traces. In Xuan Loc's muddy plain there are depressions, each approximately 1.8 meters long and spaced roughly every 2.6 meters in a straight line that stretches across the valley floor for nearly 60 meters. The depressions, when measured carefully by a geomorphologist, have a rim morphology unlike typical hoof prints and unlike standard cart impressions. The central pressure zone is oval and unnaturally deep, with peripheral shearing that suggests rotation or a complex load distribution. In plain language, the marks look like the imprint of a heavy, broad platform being carried or rolled, but no archaeologist can point to a wheel or animal foot that creates precisely that pattern. Embedded in the low center of several depressions are small flakes of a translucent stone, obsidian-like but with a different microstructure, whose geochemical signature does not match the known obsidian sources catalogued for the region. When microfossil analysts examined the soil within the depressions, they found unusually high concentrations of crushed grain phytoliths and plant wax residues consistent with millet and sorghum storage, crops that, in this area, were more typical of upland traders than of coastal rice cultivators. In other words, the patterning suggests repeated stops by something that carried bulk dry goods and pressed them into the soil in a way no standard ox cart does. But here's where it gets tricky. Oral testimonies that describe the convoy include not merely the static details of tracks but kinetic sensations that resist translation into mere tread marks. Several older witnesses, interviewed independently over decades, describe a procession that moved in near silence, its weight somehow distributed so evenly across the ground that you could not hear a single wheel. They speak of objects mounted on the leading platform, tall, boxy constructions wrapped in textiles that refracted light in peculiar ways, and a scent like old resin that clung to the air afterwards. One elder described the lead vehicle's surface as being scored with small rectangles that shone like wet rock, language that could indicate metal plating, lacquered wood, or simply the way lamplight reflected off cloth. There are also accounts of children placing their hands into the depressions and feeling a shallow warmth days later. Now, sensory testimony like this must be handled with care. Human memory is multisensory and prone to conflation. But when repeated independently, across linguistic groups and recorded in field notebooks separated by decades, these reports must be treated as data points of a different sort, observations filtered through a living mind, preserved in patterns that hint at persistent events. So we assemble theories to make sense of the pattern. A conservative, instrument-grounded explanation posits that the depressions are the result of heavy, broad-based sledges dragged across soil softened by seasonal rains. The rotation-like shearing comes from pivoting maneuvers as handlers withdrew the sledge, and the translucent flakes are the detritus of packed, heat-processed stone used as sharpening implements. In that scenario, the silent convey is a memory of pre-modern logistical practice. When the terrain is boggy, wheels are disadvantageous and sledges or skid platforms make more sense. The textile-wrapped boxes could be bales of cloth or transported goods, and the glowing rectangles are nothing more than lacquered panels catching the last light. This is sober, plausible, and economical. Yet it does not explain the anomalous geochemical signature of the translucent stone or why travelers in modern times, truck drivers familiar with every odd rut, still report seeing, at dusk, a procession moving where no sledge has been in living memory. That pushes us to consider hybrid accounts. Another line of argument takes the paleo-environmental indicators seriously and suggests Xuan Loc was part of a network of upland to lowland trade where unusual pack animals, now extinct or extirpated, were once used. If a broad-backed, low-hoofed beast carried cushioned platforms, the pressure distribution seen in the depressions could be reproduced. Some geneticists who have sampled organic residues from the site speculate that certain mitochondrial markers in dung residues might match an unknown bovid clade, but their sample sizes are tiny and the data remain preliminary. If true, this theory would redraw our understanding of domestication and transport in Southeast Asia, adding a new dimension to the story of human adaptation. It would also resonate with local legends of long-backed carriers, animals so large and low-slung that later observers labeled them as beasts of the first people, language that slides naturally into mythic imagery of giants. There is a third, rarer class of theories, speculative, and often dismissed by mainstream archaeologists, that invoke perceptual anomalies associated with particular geomagnetic and mineralogical substrates. The valley's bedrock contains veins rich in manganese and magnetite. Local miners and oral histories speak of stones that sing when wet. Some researchers have proposed that under specific atmospheric conditions, piezoelectric effects and electromagnetic oscillations could couple with human sensory systems, producing quasi-visual sensations at the edge of perception. If a collective of watchers at dusk experiences a low-level shared hallucination, then the convoy could be, in part, a group perceptual construct, a haunting generated by the place's physical chemistry interacting with expectation. That account gives teeth to reports of lights and silence but does not easily accommodate the physical depressions or the embedded artifacts. So in Xuan Loc we face an irreducible multiplicity, some evidence points toward material actors, sledges, animals, traded goods, while other clues invite us to consider the ways the landscape itself can shape what humans perceive and remember. Imagine now that you are standing at the edge of Xuan Loc at dusk, the valley cooled and the air heavy with mosquito hum. You bend to touch the rim of a depression and feel the compacted earth, the slight sheen of mineral-bearing clay. Above you, the last light sharpens the silhouette of a fallen platform limb half buried in reed, an old axle, perhaps, enough to momentarily confirm the pragmatic explanation. Yet as night gathers, there's a soft, distant chorus, a hum that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and the hair on your forearm lifts. The villagers will tell you to leave offerings at the head of the line, to honor the caravan that may still be traveling in other dimensions. To an archaeologist, such offerings may be ritual accretions. To the devotee, they are necessary diplomacy with the unseen. Both readings are valuable, because they show how human practice and material remains braid together to produce endurance. There are also peculiar artifacts that complicate tidy explanations. A thin sheet of hammered metal found tucked into a hollow log near the valley's north bank bears incised marks that do not match known alphabets but resemble, in part, tally marks used in early seafaring accounts found on far-off islands, tiny notches for goods counted, perhaps, or ritual numerations. Metallurgical testing of the sheet found traces of alloying elements consistent with tin bronze mixed with a small percentage of arsenic, a recipe seen in some coastal artifact assemblages centuries earlier. How did such a sheet come to be tucked into a log in this upland hollow? Was it lost, traded, left as an offering, or was it part of an elaborate pannier system affixed to a carried platform? Each possibility opens a pathway through history, taking us from local craft to the sweep of regional networks. Let us be candid, the most provocative interpretations also have consequences beyond the purely academic. If Xuan Loc preserves vestiges of a once widespread practice, sledges, pack species, and ritualized stopping points, then reconstructing that past could alter the story we tell about how commerce and cultural exchange shaped inland Southeast Asia. It would emphasize that bargaining and movement were not merely coastal phenomena diffusing inward. Rather, inland communities might have developed parallel, equally complex systems of transport optimized for their unique ecologies. That would democratize the past, shifting attention away from seafaring ports alone and toward a mosaic of upland ingenuity. Conversely, if the most compelling part of the Xuan Loc story is the way perception and ritual create persistent shared experiences, phantoms that no machine can replicate, then the site teaches us about the power of place to shape communal reality, about how human groups anchor meaning in the land. We also cannot ignore the mythic elements that cling like lichen to the stone. Old tales tell of a lead who doffs his head, a phrase meaning both humility and strangeness, who walked at the front and left behind a trail that smelled like resin and sounded like the far-off strike of a gong. Some of those tales include lines about men of hollow bellies, a euphemism some anthropologists read as a coded reference to storage containers or to people who traveled with heavily loaded panniers that altered their silhouette. Myth, properly understood, is not simply falsehood, it is a compressed, idiomatic history, an index of what a community cares to remember and pass on. Xuan Loc's myths compress a long practical history into images that grow richer and stranger with each telling. They also, importantly, guide behavior. Offerings are left not merely out of piety but because the myth prescribes a behavioral economy of respect, reciprocity, and caution. Finally, as we fold up our notebooks at the end of this segment, we return to the field's stubborn, necessary humility. The data are adduced, the theories are drawn and tested, laboratory reports hum in the archive. Yet when you stand in the hollow at dusk and watch the long shadow of the western ridge fold across the depressions, you sense the same thing villagers have sensed for generations, that some histories are half visible, expressed in both soil and story, and that our frameworks, sliding between the mechanical, the biological, and the perceptual, are only partial keys. Xuan Loc invites a polyphonic interpretation. A portion of it is undoubtedly material and mundane, a portion ritualized and social, and a portion lodged precisely where our instruments falter, at the edge of human perception. We still don't know, with the resolute certainty we crave, what the Phantom Convoy was, who engineered its load, or how much of the experience was produced by bodies and how much by place. But perhaps that uncertainty is the point. Some passages of the trail were meant to be watched from the margins, not fully explained, and in that watching we find a shared human ache to reorder the past into stories that keep the dead, the traded, and the strange from vanishing entirely. We still don't know. We pull away now from the places we walked, the misted hollow at Dong Hung, the limestone spine of Ban Ma, the mud-lined plain of Xuan Loc, and we hold them together in our hands like stones warmed by a long day. Each site has given us objects and testimony, measurements and myth, the tangible and the intangible braided together. In the end, the pattern they form is less like a solved puzzle than like a constellation, points that insist on connection, lines we can draw between them, but also gaps where starlight bleeds into black. That is not failure. It is the true texture of history when it lives in land as much as in books. The Phantom Convoy does not ask to be explained into neat cause and effect. It asks to be attended to be held in the mind as both question and mirror. When we bring all our pieces together, the iron with unfamiliar trace elements, the stone rows, the oddly spaced depressions, the offerings left at rock outcrops, the thermal spikes on infrared footage, the obsidian flakes from distant islands, the leaded tally tabs tucked under karst, and the repeated eyewitness accounts across generations, a single narrative emerges that is ambiguous and generous. People moved. People commemorated movement. The landscape preserved traces and, in some places, shaped what people perceived. The rest remains open. Think about the convoy not as a single thing but as a process that folded different human practices into the same route. Traders threaded goods through uplands and lowlands, priests and processions moved ritual items, soldiers and supply trains left their own hulking marks, and local communities, over centuries, added stories to ensure the living remembered those who had come before. Each mode of movement left different marks: the glossy sheen of traded bell metal, the compacted oval depressions of a broad sled, the neat row of deliberately placed stones, textile fibers charred and preserved in a crevice. Those physical traces are stubborn. They cannot be wholly explained away by a single account. Instead, they insist that we narrate in layers: economic, social, ritual, and perceptual. Economically, the places we visited speak to unexpectedly elastic trade networks. Obsidian geochemical signatures that trace to island sources, metal alloys that include ores from distant uplands, and tally tabs that mimic accounting practices from seafaring merchants together suggest that movement inland was not subordinate to coastal exchange, but was part of a multidirectional system. People inland were not merely passive recipients of coastal goods. They were active agents of exchange, crafting local variants of imported bells, recasting metal into locally meaningful forms, and establishing nodes, clearings, ridges, hollows, where goods and ritual intersected. If one conclusion should stand out from the artifacts, it is this: material culture often tells a different story than the maps we inherit. Commerce was creative. It adapted to topography with technologies, sledges, pack systems, ritualized processions, shaped by the needs of people who had to move heavy things across difficult soils and dense forests. Socially, the sites remind us that movement is a social choreography. Processions and convoys demanded coordination: people who loaded and packed, people who tended animals, people who maintained route knowledge. Ritual practices, offerings at rocks and ridges, nocturnal processions that left the scent of incense or resin, probably did much of the work of social memory. Ritual codified routes, signaled boundaries, and created shared meanings that made dangerous journeys tolerable. In communities where written records were scarce or ephemeral, story and ceremony are what anchor knowledge through generations. The phantom qualities we encountered, the silent lights, the lead that leaves no engine hum, are in part the sensory language of communities describing memories whose original practical details may have blurred into metaphor. That does not make the stories less valid. It makes them different kinds of evidence, texts to be read, not with anachronistic literalness, but with sensitivity to the grammar of memory. Ritual, as we saw at Ban Ma and Dong Hung, is not decorative, it is functional. Offerings left at night are safety protocols, contracts between travelers and place. Leaving a bowl of rice at the foot of a rock may have been an act of reciprocity, a way to placate spirits thought to govern safe passage, or it may have been the vestige of an older trade etiquette practiced by merchant guilds. When an offering appears along a ridge, the place gains a social authority. It becomes named. Those names survive in stories that describe lead figures and giants, lights that pass like lanterns without smoke, and people with clothes that made them seem taller or stranger. These stories fuse practicality with cosmology. To travel is to enter a world where the seen and unseen overlap. Perceptually, the landscapes themselves teach us something crucial about human knowing. Where karst and mineral veins meet certain humidity and temperature regimes, where electromagnetic anomalies spike, where soil chemistry has been altered by centuries of human occupation, the land can produce physiological effects, optical illusions, scents, subtle sounds, that, when interpreted by attentive human observers, become narratives. Will-o'-the-wisps and bioluminescence, atmospheric ducting that bends light, low-frequency electromagnetic oscillations that make the hair on the arm rise. None of these alone fully accounts for the reports of solid depressions and metal alloys from faraway sources, but they do help explain why some moments become meaningful. The land does not merely hold history like a book, it participates in its telling. When we weigh competing explanations, conservative archaeological readings that emphasize sledges and trade, geological theories that privilege luminescence and electromagnetic phenomena, and mythic frames that allow for giants and time slips, we are not obliged to choose a single victor. The more generous and truer posture is to accept a plural causality. Different kinds of evidence point in different directions, and the most complete reconstruction is one that can accommodate material and perceptual realities at once. To insist on a single explanation is to flatten a landscape that is, by its nature, stratified and layered. There is a moral in that methodological humility. The Phantom Convoy resists tidy resolution because it reminds us that human life is complicated and that the traces people leave are entangled with the stories they tell. Histories of movement, trade routes, ritual paths, military logistics, are also histories of memory, of how communities name and remember what matters. In a place like the Ho Chi Minh Trail and its older strata, the past is not a fossil to be extracted intact. It is a living conversation between earth and human voice. We learn as much from the way people remember as from artifacts, because memory shows us how communities choose to make meaning out of movement and danger. What, then, are the stakes of not knowing? They are not merely intellectual. If we accept that inland networks were as complex as coastal ones, we shift where we direct research, preservation, and respect. We begin to honor upland communities as producers, not merely as recipients. If we accept that the land itself can affect perception, we bring more interdisciplinary rigor, geophysics, sensory anthropology, and environmental chemistry, into archaeological practice. And if we accept that myth carries compressed historical knowledge, we prioritize ethnography and oral history as evidence, not as mere embellishment. The Phantom Convoy teaches us that humility is a discipline. We must continue measuring and testing, yes, but we must also continue listening. So what do we ask you to do as you walk away from this story? First, carry the image of layered knowledge with you. Remember that an object is never only an object, it is also a signal in a social field. Second, respect local narrators, villagers, elders, retired drivers, whose lived experience animates places in ways our instruments do not capture. Third, support interdisciplinary inquiry that refuses to treat the uncanny as frivolous and refuses to treat myth as irrational. Those are not mutually exclusive positions. Finally, be willing to live with not knowing. It is a discomfort that yields a different kind of gratitude for the world's capacity to astonish us, to keep a few doors closed even as it reveals others. We will end where we began, with the sensory image that calls us toward curiosity. Fog clinging to a hollow at dawn, lanterns crawling along a ridge at dusk, depressions in a valley that do not match any will we have catalogued. The Phantom Convoy is not a single secret waiting to be unveiled with a single act of excavation or a single lab report. It is a chorus of small mysteries, objects, sensations, stories, that together tell us why places matter. They matter because they are where human lives and the stubborn features of the earth commingle. They matter because sometimes the most profound revelations come not from proving that a story is literally true but from understanding why people needed that story in the first place. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.